my wrestling and in my doubts, in my failures, you won't walk out. Your great love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea.
Follow you, not from all my days. Fix my eyes on your face. Forever free in unending grace. Ready? 'Cause you are my freedom. We lift you higher, lift you higher. Your love, never ending. Oh, oh, you are alive. Nothing can.
I will follow you, oh, my lighthouse, my lighthouse. I will trust the promise. You will carry me safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. I won't fear what tomorrow brings. With each morning I'll rise and sing. My God's love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea. Oh, you are my light.
But Daniel's story happened, it started when he was a teenager. He was a young person, just like you. Although the Bible does specifically say that he was good looking and intelligent, so maybe that's where the similarity ends. I'm sorry. I'm joking. Daniel was young when his land was invaded and he was sent to a whole new land, a different culture, Babylon. And it was different to anything that he had ever known, different to everything that he felt comfortable in, and he was to be embedded with his mates in this new culture. They had to eat the food of the culture, they had to learn the religion of the culture, and be steeped in everything to do with their new land, even to the point where they were given brand new names. And the king at this time, he really wanted them to reject their God, the God that they knew and worshipped, the God of this brand new culture. And I guess that's pretty hard for us to imagine, isn't it? Being sent off to a whole different land where they do things very differently. But Daniel's story, like Esther's story yesterday, is a story of courage. Now Daniel faced 3 tests, which I'm going to talk to you briefly about this morning. Daniel's first test was a test of compromise. Daniel was taken to Babylon. He was told that he could eat the best kind of food, the food that even the king ate. It was like feasts every single day, the best food, the best wine. It's like my idea of actual heaven, the choicest foods that were available. But if Daniel ate that food, he would be defiling himself. It was food that shouldn't be eaten in his culture that he knew. Would he stick to his beliefs? Daniel stood firm in his beliefs. He asked for nothing but vegetables and water. And yet, at the end of that period of time, he was stronger than all of his friends. Daniel was faced with compromise. Was he going to eat the food of this brand new culture? But he stood firm, and God honoured him, and God blessed him. Second test was a test of conviction. Now Daniel, remember, had a firm belief in his God. He knew the God that he served and he worshipped. And yet the second test was a test that would challenge that conviction. The king decreed that everybody should bow down to a golden statue of himself. Anybody that didn't do this would be thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel, remember, had a conviction. He believed in this God. And so there was no way that he could ever bow down to this gold statue. And so Daniel and his friends told the king that they would not bow down to the gold statue. When the king heard this, he ordered that the furnace that they were to be sent to would be heated 7 times the heat that it normally would. I think it's safe to say the king was pretty angry. And Daniel and his friends were thrown into the fire, but as we know from the story, they were not harmed. God honoured and blessed them and gave Daniel a higher position in the kingdom. And Daniel's third test was a test of courage. Courage is doing something that is scary. It's having the strength to do something, even in the face of danger or pain. Now, at this point, Daniel had risen through the ranks, and he was pretty high up in the kingdom, and there were people who were jealous of his position, and so they were out to get him. And they realised that Daniel didn't ever really do anything bad. There was nothing they could easily convict him for, but they knew that he worshipped his God. And so they sneakily arranged for a new rule that would definitely get Daniel in trouble. Anybody who prays to anybody but the king should be thrown into a den of lions. King Nebuchadnezzar was nothing if he wasn't dramatic. So Daniel faces another test, a test of courage. Would he be brave enough, even in the face of danger? And yet Daniel prayed. He continued praying to his God. He knew what it would cost him, and yet he continued to pray. And as you probably know, Daniel was thrown into the den of lions, but he was not harmed. Every time Daniel faced a test, he didn't compromise on his beliefs. Every time Daniel faced a test, he stood by his convictions. And every time Daniel faced a test, he had courage in the face of danger. And every time he did this, God honoured him, and God blessed him, and God showed him favour. And that was a cool story, right? I love the story of Daniel. I think it's cool, and it reminds me of Sunday school. It's a great story. But what does that have to do with us today? Well, Daniel was faced with a culture that was entirely antagonistic to everything he knew. He was in a culture that wanted to get him to change his beliefs. And while I think it's unlikely that any of us are going to be taken from our land, taken from our families, and sent to a land with a crazy king that wants us all dead, the truth is that we do live within cultures that are very different to our own. You see, we're part of a culture, all of us here, we're part of a culture, whether that's church or family or soul purpose, we're part of a distinct culture. We are part of a culture that honours God. That's part of who we are. We honour God, we worship God, and that is our culture. That's what we know. And yet, sometimes it seems that the culture we step into, whether that's when we go to school, whether that's in your online friendship groups, whether that's in your families, we step into a culture that seems very different from the culture we know, the culture where we honour God. And maybe there are times where you feel a bit like Daniel, that everyone around you seems to be doing something very different to you, and maybe honouring a different God to you. And if that's you, I think there are 3 things really quickly that we can learn from Daniel. The first is not to compromise when you're faced with a new culture. Are you just going to go along with what everybody else is doing? And this can sometimes be so subtle that you barely even see it. For Daniel, it was food. Was he going to eat the pork chops, or was he not? It seemed subtle, but actually it was a compromise that Daniel knew he didn't want to do. And I don't know what that compromise looks like for you in your culture. Maybe it's subtle. Maybe it's things like gossiping, lying. Maybe it's doing things that you know are against your culture, you know you shouldn't be doing. Maybe what the culture says is okay, but make you compromise what you believe. Daniel didn't compromise. and God honoured his faithfulness. The second test that you might face: stand by your convictions. Daniel knew that his God was the only God. He was convinced of that. He was convicted of that, and his convictions were tested. I wonder what gods in our own culture we are asked to bow down to. Whether it's a god of self-image, a god of money, a god of success. Will we bow down to these other gods, or will we stand by our convictions and honour God? And our third test, courage. Be courageous. In Daniel's final test, people were plain old out to get him. They were antagonistic towards him. They wanted him to change his beliefs. It was a tough situation, and yet Daniel was brave enough to be courageous. In your culture, in your schools, in your families, it may feel sometimes like there are people who are just plain old out to get you, to make a mockery of what you believe, who will test you to see if your faith is strong enough. Maybe for you, it's in that RE lesson when people seem openly hostile to everything you believe. Daniel, in the face of danger, was courageous, and God honoured his courage. And so for some of you today, Daniel's story might remain just that, a nice story that we can listen to. But for others of you, what Daniel went through, those tests that he faced, they might resonate with you. Maybe you feel sometimes like you're living in an alien culture, whether that's in your family, in your school, in your friendship group. Maybe it just feels hard to always be the one who's doing something differently. Maybe the things you do and you say are totally different to everybody else. And maybe you're just starting to feel a bit fed up with how that feels, to always feel different to everybody else. If that's you, and you feel like it's a constant battle, I believe that God is saying this morning, take courage. Daniel faced hard tests. Tests that, honestly, I'm not sure that I would be able to pass. And yet Daniel stood firm. He didn't compromise. He didn't turn away from his convictions. And he had courage. And God was faithful to him. God knows how hard it is for some of you. But I believe he's saying to all of us today, take courage. Take courage. I'm going to ask the band to come up, and we're going to sing the song in response to this. As the band come up,